Welcome to our Sunday school class this morning. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 11 and also in chapter 12. So if you guys want to turn there, we'll get going there in a little bit. To catch you guys up, we've been talking about Jehoiada the priest and Joash the king. And we've been talking about this idea of the head and the body. And we got on this discussion because there was deception going on, and there's a number of times where deception is used in the Bible. And so we have to understand the context of that because there are times when deception is the appropriate way to go in the Bible. But you don't want to, obviously lying is not a good thing in the Bible, so we have to understand, well, how does that work exactly? If we're not supposed to lie, and yet some people do deceive, and it's seen as a good thing in Scripture, how do we reconcile those things? And so we talked about this idea of the word and the body. So we can look at this as the head and the body. So like if this is our big head here, and then our body's down here, this is not a very healthy person. The idea behind this is that the head is providing meaning and purpose, glory and blessing. That's what the head is supposed to do to the body. You can think about it in terms of a body. You know, your head, it decides how to dress your body. It glorifies it. It decides what your body should do. It gives the body meaning and purpose as it carries out things that the head discerns as meaningful, useful, good, glorious. And then the body is blessed through that because the body becomes something that it wouldn't normally. I was reading this week about children who were raised by wolves. And the weird thing is that almost all of them come from India, all of the stories. And they have pictures of some of the kids. And so it's not, they used to think that this was fake, and now they realize that no, some of these kids really were raised by wolves in India. And it's a very strange thing, but all the things that you see about it is that none of these end up having a good outcome. Like all of these stories of kids raised by wolves, none of them turn out well. And it's always children. And the reason that they think it was always children was because you're not going to grow into adulthood being raised by wolves. You're not going to make it that far. And so they had a story of this kid it was actually the inspiration for the Jungle Book movie, which fascinatingly enough, the Jungle Book makes it look like, oh, this isn't great. He's being raised by these animals and everything's, and he sees the girl and he seems to fit in just well with her and all that kind of stuff. In reality, what happened was some hunters came across a young feral boy who was crawling on all fours and was naked, who was with a wolf, and they went into this cave. And the hunters couldn't get the boy to come out, and so they ended up smoking. They built a fire and had smoke go into the cave, and finally the wolf and the kid came out, and they killed the wolf, and they grabbed the kid and took him to an orphanage, and they tried for this guy's entire life to teach him, how to speak, how to do anything. He never could learn it. And what they found was that his intelligence was severely affected by not being around humans. The thing is that if you grew up as a child and you are only interacting with animals, then there's only a small part of your brain that's actually being used or exercised, and the guy was kind of hunched over. He finally learned to walk. It took years and years for him to learn to walk, but he never could walk well. And so his body was misshapen and deformed. He had a lot of problems, and he ended up dying. The only thing that really he took on of a kind of human nature was that he loved smoking. He ended up dying of a disease in, I would say, like probably early 20s, mid-20s, but he looked older than he was. And every single case that they've had is like that, has been very similar. Never learned to speak, incredibly mentally challenged and slow, a lot of physical defects and ailments. And so what we see here is that the word, the idea of the head or the word, it does glorify the body, and the more that gets exercised, the more glorious the body actually can become. And the issue here is that the leadership of anything, that's the role that it performs. That's what leadership is. That's what leadership does. So you can look at it as far as leadership of a family, leadership of a country, and from a biblical perspective, in order for that leadership to be valid, it has to be performing this function. And when it doesn't perform that function, it's no longer valid leadership, and it's using the word, it's misusing the word. Because the word that's coming down is being misused, then the worship, support, glory, and embodiment that goes up is going to be false as well. That's the way that the Bible views it. And so we talked about that last week. And the reason that's important is we're going to see that kind of frames this whole idea of these stories that we're going to be looking at, of Jehoiada the priest and Joash the king and all of the things that happen as a result of that. So let's go ahead and start reading chapter 11. We'll begin here in verse 4, and let's go ahead and hit the first paragraph, and then we'll pause, and then we'll continue.
But in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Kerites and of the guards, and had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them, and put them under oath in the house of the Lord. And he showed them the king's son. And he commanded them, This is the thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you, those who come off duty on the Sabbath, and guard the king's house, another third being at the gate Sur, and a third at the gate behind the guards, shall guard the palace. And the 2 divisions of you, which come on duty in force on the Sabbath, and guard the house of the Lord on behalf of the king, shall surround the king, each with his weapons in his hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be put to death. Be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in.
Okay, so what's happening here is Jehoiada's not only hidden Joash, but now he's making a play for the throne. And again, the reason that he's doing this is because Athaliah, who is taken the throne, is not, she has no rightful claim to it. And so what he's doing is he's setting up this situation. Now, what you'll see is that there's some similarities here to Solomon. You remember when Solomon became king, there was another play for the throne going on at the same time. And so Bathsheba said, hey, we need to move right now. David is sick, and somebody else is going to try to take the throne. We need to make sure that Solomon's the one who gets the throne. And so there was all this behind-the-scenes stuff going on in order to get him the throne. The same thing's happening right now, and Jehoiada is doing this. Now, what he's doing is he's organizing the guards so that the people who are faithful and who are behind this sort of conspiracy, they're all going to be on duty at the same time. So he's going to have kind of an overwhelming force there when he makes his move. That's what's happening. Okay, let's continue.
The captains did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and they brought his men who were to go off duty on the Sabbath with those who were to come on duty on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And the priest gave the captains the spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house on behalf of the king. Then he brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, Long live the king.
Okay, so what's happening? Yeah, go ahead.
Confirming this is actually then in Judea. This is the king of Judea.
Yeah, So one of the things that's interesting about this is that we have a priest here who's at the head of this. And most of what we've been dealing with in the book of 2 Kings and also 1 Kings is we've been dealing with a lot of prophets and not a lot of priests. Now, the reason is because we've been dealing mostly with the northern kingdom. And we're not going to be dealing with priests in the northern kingdom because remember, they've set up their own temple and their own worship through the golden calf. And so those priests are not legitimate priests. And so...
They call them priests, right?
Yeah, they have their own priesthood up there. Yep, they do have their own priesthood up there. But those priests aren't seen as legitimate priests. And so what we see is that God's not going to work through them because obviously they're not going to work to reestablish what's right because their livelihood depends on what's wrong. And what we're going to see through all this is kind of the role and the relationship between priesthood and kingship and the people. Okay, and there's an important relationship, and this is playing out right now, where we have Jehoiada, who is a good priest. And Jehoiada, because he's a good priest, is raising up within the temple, he's raising up a king. So what we have here, if you recall, we have this picture of reality where you have the wilderness is the biggest part of reality. And then within that, you have the city, right? And the city is well ordered. It's kind of like the garden. In fact, interestingly, when you start off in Genesis, Adam and Eve and God are all in a garden, but at the end, they're all in the city, right? Because there's the development that's happened, there's a glorification that's happened. But the city is the place, it's like the garden, it's the place that's well ordered. And then you have, in the middle of that, you have the temple. And the temple is the most ordered place because it's the place where God resides. And it's the place where God's will is done without any mixture, you can say. Okay, so what happens is, and this happens in Genesis. So in Genesis, Adam and Eve, when they're put in the garden, they're supposed to do what God says. They're performing the role of priests. They're in this area where God is. They're in this center area right there. That's where they're hanging out. So their job is to be priests. And eventually they're going to have to become kings. They're going to have to leave the garden because God said to fill and subdue the earth. And so eventually they're going to have to go out there and they're going to have to pattern everything after the garden. So basically what happens is the garden expands. Right? The thing that's well ordered, it will expand and it'll end up covering the whole earth. But that's a different job. That's kingship. So expanding the borders is kingship. But doing God's will is priesthood. Does that make sense? There's a difference between these two things. So if you're a priest, what is your job? Your job is just to follow the commands of God. You don't have to exercise discernment. You don't have to figure out, well, in this case, what do I do? Because you're within the box, basically. A priest is a house servant, and the house servant is just to do what his master tells him. But as you do that, and as you're formed by it, what happens is you're supposed to become mature enough to go out into the world and take things that are disordered and make them ordered like the garden. All right, so the idea is that Adam and Eve will go out eventually, their descendants. They'll go out eventually and they'll have the wisdom and discernment to make the rest of the world into the garden, to develop it, to glorify it, to make it what it should be. Well, in this story, what you have is you have a priest who's raising a king up within the temple, and now he's going to put him on the throne. And so now that king is going to go out into the city. Once he's made king, he's going to go out into the city and order the city in the way that he should. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so what's happening here is that in order to do that, he has to overthrow the person who's on the throne who doesn't belong on the throne. Okay, so that's actually a picture of Jesus, right? So Jesus is with God. He's in the throne room of God, right? He's co-equal with God. And then he goes into the world and he has to dethrone the person who's on the throne, and then he has to inaugurate the kingdom. This whole story is just a prelude to what Jesus is going to do. Okay? And so we have a faithful priest who's doing this. Let's go ahead and continue. And what we're going to see here is that there is some opposition to this, and there's always opposition.
When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar, according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason!" Then Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, "Bring her out between the ranks, and put to death with the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." So they laid hands on her, and she went through the horses' entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death.
Okay, so what happens is that she cries treason, which is fascinating, and they don't listen to her and they put her to death. Okay, that's kind of the way that it always works in these situations. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on with the next paragraph.
And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. Then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces. And they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. And he took the captains, the Kerites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he took his seat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house.
Okay, so notice that at the end here we have this sentence that the city is quiet after this, because again, the king now is gone from the temple into his throne in the city, and he's established order. And by establishing order, he's created peace. He's created, and what should end up happening is he'll create not only peace, but he'll create prosperity and blessing as well, if things are ordered correctly. And so there's quite a few things happening here that we want to look at. So first of all, he's made king in the palace, or in the temple. And one of the things to understand is that in the temple there was these two pillars. And they were great bronze pillars. And they're at the entrance to the temple. And these two pillars are Jachin or Jachin. I'm not sure. The pronunciations of Hebrew stuff is always beyond me. And Boaz. And these two pillars are the priest pillar and the king pillar. And that's what stands at the entrance to the temple. So the king establishes the temple, and the priest serves in the temple. And the king builds the temple, and the priest then serves in the temple. And you serve in the temple in order to learn the wisdom and understanding to go out and be a king and to establish things. The king is always expanding. So remember when there's that story of David and Bathsheba, and it says that it was springtime when the kings went out to war? And we look at that and go, well, that's weird. Like, right, yeah, it's springtime, here we go. It's such a strange thing for us to think about. But the idea behind it is important, that what you do is you go out and you establish order and rule. You expand the kingdom. You expand the order and rule. And from the biblical perspective, what's outside the borders of the kingdom is chaos. It's wilderness. It's not established. But you go out there and you establish that order. And there's always opposition to establishing the order. And you always have to overcome the opposition to establishing the order. That's just the way that it works. And now if you have a good kingdom, a wise king and a good king, then people will want that. And there's always people in power who will oppose it. But most of the people will go, hey, I'd rather be ruled by this guy than this guy. But that's the idea behind this, is that these two pillars represent these two positions, the priest and the king. Now, the question is then, okay, well, what about the prophet? Well, the prophet is not so much an office as a relationship. Okay, so a prophet is somebody who has a relationship with God, but not necessarily an office given by God. His job is to be the person who goes and brings the word of God to these officers so that they can then do what they're supposed to do. And so he doesn't really have a pillar. It's not something that's formalized like that. It's something that's a lot more informal and casual, I guess, is one way you could say it. So the idea here is that these two pillars have meaning. And the interesting thing is that if you actually look up these pillars online, what do you think you'll find mostly references to? If you look at Jachin and Boaz, just type that into Google, you'll come up with an interesting, most of the references you get are to Freemasons. So the Freemasons took this idea and kind of ran with it and used it in ways that I don't think are the way that they were meant to be used. But they were big into that.
So they twisted and tainted it in their own ways?
Yeah, so they're kind of, Freemasonry is kind of Gnostic. It's the idea is that there's some kind of this special knowledge that you can get, and then you know how to rule the world. And some of it is based, there's a little bit of truth in it, but there's also a lot of weirdness in it. And one of the big things is that when you get into these Gnostic type ideas is that these guys believe that if you find the secret knowledge, then you're going to get what you want, and you'll know how to do things and move in the world and create what you want. But that doesn't include having to abide by any kind of moral constraints yourself.
Or faith in God.
Right. It's not about faith in God. It's not about righteousness. It's about knowing. And therefore it's kind of like magic. It's like as long as you know the incantation, you can get what you want. And so it's very much a pagan type view of the world.
Been doing that since the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, Babylon.
Right.
The Tower of Babylon.
Yeah. So the idea here then is that there's a covenant that's made between God and the people and the king. And what we want to talk about is, well, what is the nature of that covenant, and why does this get made now? And we've had this Queen Athaliah on the throne, or Athaliah on the throne, and she's been terrible, and now we have a new king, and so there's a reestablishment of covenant between God and the king and the people. And so, first of all, we want to look at the fact that covenants are established in blood and in the atoning nature of blood. All right, so we had Queen Athaliah, who gets killed by the horse gate. Okay, and the fact that she's killed at the gate is important. So why would you kill people who are rebellious, treasonous, criminals? Why would you take those people out of the city and kill them?
Out of the city?
Yeah.
Take the trash out. I mean, I'm being somewhat
Right.
facetious, but ultimately, you don't belong in here.
Right.
So you're going to be disposed of.
Yeah, the idea is that these are people who have run counter to the order and well-being of the city. They don't, you're perfectly right, they don't belong in the city. And so they're taken out and they're killed. It's the idea of having priests with spears and shields around the temple to keep things that don't belong in there out. If you're going to go into the temple, if you're going to go into the city, then you have to behave in the way that is proper to being in there. And if you're not, then you should have stayed out of the city, right? You should have stayed out there where everything was chaotic and where chaotic people belong. Now, we don't have that view anymore. In fact, what's really interesting is I was watching with Tyler with Eric this documentary about Seattle. And so where do all the homeless encampments in Seattle, where are they all at? Are they outside the city? No, they're in the city. What part of the city do you think they're in?
I think that recently they overtook a hotel.
Yeah, they've been in a lot of hotels. But basically, what's that? A lot of street corners. The area right around the courthouse is the worst part of the city. Yep. And it's so bad that they actually thought about moving the courthouse.
Oh, it's just easier to do that.
Right. We're going to leave the chaotic people there, but we're going to... the interesting thing is if these people had any kind of theological knowledge at all, they would have to hang their head in shame, because this image of the courthouse with these homeless encampments, and this documentary was made by a guy who's works for the news station, the local news station, and so they were going down there and shooting footage of people shooting up. There was video of crimes happening. This woman was down there, and she was supposed to be a juror, and so she went down to the courthouse, but they actually moved the entrance because it was so dangerous by the entrance of the courthouse. They moved the entrance. She didn't know where the new one was. She went to the old entrance, couldn't get in. She was looking on her phone to find the new entrance, and a guy came up behind her and punched her in the head and knocked her face first into the cement. And she was pretty severely injured by that.
Can I ask, is this before the summer or after or during?
I think this is ongoing. This has been going on for the past couple of years. They had a guy who was who beat up. I think he was a prosecutor or somebody related to the court, and he had 72 convictions, and the DA was recommending release for him. And the judge actually gave him 364 days in jail, which is the most the judge could give him. And the DA and the Defense Attorney Association wrote a letter urging him to resign because he's disgraced the bar, and that and basically they stopped. Every time a case would go before this judge, they would say that there was a conflict of interest, that they couldn't have this judge in their case, and so he couldn't hear cases anymore, and he ended up retiring to the Valley here because he was basically done as a judge. And so the thing is that that's the wrong picture. So like if you have a situation where there's chaos now in the city, and there's not these levels that we've talked about where you have the wilderness out at the outside, and then you have the city, and then you have the temple. If the wilderness now is everywhere, then you have to reestablish the covenant. And this covenant is always going to be established in blood. There's always going to be atonement. And you want to think about, well, why is atonement always necessary? So think about it this way. Let's say this Joash is hidden in the temple, and he becomes king, and Athaliah is still on the throne. How's that going to work? It's not. Right? It's not going to work. So Athaliah has to be off the throne. Well, is Athaliah just going to leave? Is Athaliah just going to go, oh, okay, I guess I'm done. It was nice while it lasted. No, yeah. Yeah, how did she get on the throne? Yeah, exactly. She got on the throne by killing everybody that was a rival to her. Yeah, that was a threat. What's that? Yeah, she's got it. So that's the idea, is that it's always established in blood. And because the old thing has to be killed. The old way has to be done away with. Now, when we get to Jesus, the covenant is established in his blood. And the idea is that when we are identified with him, and then we identify with his death, that Jesus is taking all the old sin and all that is dying in him. And then Paul urges us to, each day, to take up our cross, to die to sin, and to do those kinds of things. Why? Because otherwise the new covenant can't be established. It would just be the new sin. So that's the idea here, is that it's always established in blood. And one of the things that's important to see is that what Joash is going to do is he's going to spend a lot of time dealing with the temple and reestablishing the temple. Now, this is a picture of a painting, and it might be kind of hard to see. It's a little dark, and there's a lot of small things going on. But this is actually a picture of the dedication of Solomon's temple, and it's not correct at all. I mean, it's not. This is nothing of like what it would have looked like. This is probably medieval, or probably later than that, probably Renaissance artist's conception of it. And his conception of it is very symbolic. And if you can't probably see, but right here is the altar, and there's fire on the altar. But what you have is you have all these windows up here with all kinds of people in it. And there's basically there's people down below, there's people above, there's people everywhere. And that's his picture of the dedication of the temple. Well, the fascinating thing about that is that that's really kind of symbolically accurate, even though it's not historically accurate. Because the temple is the people. So when you look at the temple and what it represents God living among the people. Okay? And so we'll look at this picture here. This is a picture of the tabernacle at night and the encampment. And if you remember, the encampment of Israel was to be a certain way around the tabernacle. So the tents that were really close to the tabernacle, who was in those? The priests, yep. It was all the Levites. The Levites were encamped right around it. And then after that, outside of that, who was there? The tribes. And then after that, who was there? Yep, it was the mixed multitude. So the temple or tabernacle itself was actually a picture of the people. It was a picture of the tribes. And the idea is that God is in the midst of the tribes, and he's actually enthroned in the tribes. And the covenant it's actually a picture of God's covenant with the people, because the covenant is how God is enthroned in the people, right? So let's say this. If we'll take Ken as an example. And if Ken has the covenant and the covenant says don't lie, and so Ken says, oh, well, I can't lie, that I need to speak the truth. Well, Ken is now embodying the word. He's embodying the spirit. He's now embodying, he's being the body for the head, right? He's doing that. And so that's what's happening. And as Ken does that, then God is embodied in him. And as all Ken's neighbors do that, then God is embodied in them. And you know what I'm saying? And so that's the way that it functions. So even in the Old Testament, this wasn't so much about, oh, here's a list of rules. And it's actually about the fact that you agree with this and you support it and you are kind of possessed by it. You embody it. Right, that's what you do. That governs your actions. And so God is actually there in a pillar of smoke and fire, but that's symbolic of the way that God is actually present, which is he's present in the actions and embodiment of the people. And so that's why this picture is actually a good picture of what the dedication of the temple symbolically is, because it's a picture of all of these people gathered around, and the idea is that they are the temple and they are embodying who God is. God is physically present because they are acting that out. All right, so the idea here is that when you make a covenant with the people, you renew a covenant, and then he goes on he'll go on and he'll start working on trying to, he's going to try to rebuild the temple. And again, rebuilding the temple is only a picture of symbolically rebuilding the people and their relationship with God. And it's a relationship between him and the people in God, because his job is to make the physical boundaries and laws in such a way that the people can embody God. That's the way that we can kind of think about it. Right? So, for instance, if I have a law that if you make a contract and you break it, then you're going to go to jail. Well, what I'm doing as a king is I'm setting up the society so that people will embody truth, right? You can't lie. You make a contract, you can't lie. You can't deceive. You can't, right? So I do things like make fraud against the law. People say all the time, you can't legislate morality. Have you guys heard that? No, the reality is that's all that you legislate.
What are you doing?
Yeah. If you're not legislating morality, then you're just pulling laws out of a hat, you know. Then you're basically legislating immorality. That's what you do as a king. Is your job is to understand the Word of God. You've been brought up in the temple. You understand who God is. You understand the nature of God. And then you go out and you legislate that so that becomes the way that your society is ordered. Okay, now, the important thing is that it's a three-way covenant. It's not just between the king and the people. It's between God and the king and the people. And the reason that's important, we can illustrate that with this fine work of art by Michael Craig Martin called An Oak Tree. Now, I've used this example in sermons before, and you guys might recall it. So you guys recall why this is called an oak tree?
According to him, it is.
It is an oak tree.
Yeah.
Now, there's a funny story about this where this piece of art was purchased by a very large sum of money by the Australian National Gallery.
That's stupidity.
There's also an artist's copy that some private collector purchased. So if this private collector had gone to the store and bought all these items, it would have cost him probably $125, but instead he bought them from the artist as an artist's copy, and so he probably paid millions for it. So this is an oak tree, and why is this an oak tree? Do you guys remember what we talked about? The artist will say it is an oak tree, and in fact, when it was being brought back to Australia, because it's gone on tour at a bunch of different museums everywhere, the packaging said it was an oak tree, and so the Australian border people, customs, they basically said, "Oh, you can't bring that in here. This is vegetation. You can't bring this in here." And he's like, "No, it's a glass of water." So even he had to, yeah.
So when it's convenient,
Right,
or
exactly.
expedient,
Yes.
what a liar.
So what he was actually doing was he was actually trying to make this point about art and the artist and the audience. And that point is that something is art because the artist believes that it's art, and because the people who go to see it say that it's art. And that's the only thing that makes it art.
This is our covenant of agreement.
Right, so there's a covenant between the artists and the public, and that covenant is actually built, that covenant's actually built on faith, and that as long as the artist has faith in this and the people have faith in it, then it is what they say it is. So this is an oak tree because he says it is, and because you will believe that it is. Now, what's the problem with that?
It's not.
Right, so he has
Conform to truth and reality.
right, so he has artists and people in a covenant.
And God is not present.
Right, so God is not present in this covenant. So it can be whatever he wants it and whatever the people will accept.
That's a failure.
Well, the problem is, yes, if God is not part of the covenant, then the problem is we all know that this is not an oak tree. And even he had to admit it wasn't an oak tree when they basically weren't going to let it back into the country. So the problem is that any kind of covenant actually has to include God, because God made the world, and we have to be in agreement. And so the king or the artist this covenant always has to be in three parts. If it's not, then we have a problem. Right? What's the problem?
Tyranny.
So
Leadership.
the leader basically gives the meaning and purpose. He defines what the people are.
He set himself up as God.
Right, so by
The highest authority.
right, he's the highest authority. So he says, look, you guys, we're 1,000-year Reich. We are the master race. And so he's saying we're the master race. And that's what a leader does, is he defines who the people are. And then the people said, yes, we are. We are a master race. This is who we are. And so they went out and they acted as if this were true. What happened to his 1,000-year Reich?
Didn't last that
Didn't
long.
last quite that long, right? Why didn't it last that long? Because they didn't bring God into the equation.
There were other people who disagreed.
There were a lot of other people who disagreed, and all of reality disagreed. And the problem was they weren't the master race. And everybody showed them that they weren't the master race. And so the problem is because they didn't include God in their covenant, then this didn't work out very well. And it's important to understand that this goes on all the time on a lot smaller scale. It goes on all the time. And people say, well, I'm wonderful because I'm me. Oh, really? Are you?
And if you don't have God to tell you what's the truth,
Right.
then your definition of truth is what matters to
Right.
you. And, even if it doesn't agree with his definition of truth is different
Right.
than yours.
And what you see is that there's this big movement now to get everybody to agree with you. Because, see, they view identity as a negotiation between themselves and the rest of the people. Because let's say this. Let's say I say I'm an oak tree. Right? And people now are free to create whatever identity, choose whatever identity they want. There's somebody that thinks that he's a big building. There's somebody who thinks that they're a yellow-skinned dragon. I mean, you name it, right? So let's say I believe that I'm an oak tree. Well, it used to be that people who thought they were an oak tree, they took them and put them in a mental institution. Now, what you want to do is you need other people to agree with you, because if they don't treat you like you're an oak tree, then it's hard to feel like you're an oak tree, right? Right, so that's the thing. So there was this guy, you guys might have remembered, he was a 52-year-old man, and he was living as an 8-year-old child. Girl. 52-year-old man living as his 8-year-old girl. And he had people that were in his community that would bring him over for play dates with their young daughters. And they were celebrated. Oh, isn't this a great thing? Isn't this wonderful?
No,
right?
It is not.
So he needs a covenant, right? He can't just think this as himself. He needs other people to agree with him so he can function like that. And so the idea is that as long as we're all agreeing, and that's why the big push right now is for all of us that we all need to agree that people are whatever they say they are, and that way they will be able to live such wonderful, glorious, fulfilled lives. And the problem with this is the same problem that we see being dealt with here with Jehoiada and Joash, is that you have to have God involved in that. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster. Because ultimately, if one person thinks that they're a teapot, we can call that crazy, but when the whole society thinks that that person is a teapot and treats them that way, that's a special kind of foolishness that gets punished by history in really severe ways. We're not free to decide what we are. There's God actually decides, and He's involved in the process. And so the king's job is to know God and how God made His people, and then to make a covenant with those people that involves God and God's definition, and to set up the rules and everything to make that possible. And so that's what he's doing. Now, the problem comes to this. If a glass of water can be an oak tree, what can the people be? Well, they can be whatever they want to. Well, they can also be nothing. So this is a picture that was taken during the Ukrainian famine. And the Ukrainian famine happened because basically Joseph Stalin decided that millions of people were not important to his plans. In fact, they were obstacles to his plans. And that he was just going to let them starve to death. And so the interesting thing that happened was, and interesting, you can say terrible, thing that happened was when this famine was going on that killed 8 million people, the Soviet Union was actually exporting grain. These people were growing the grain. It was all being confiscated to feed the people that Joseph Stalin wanted to feed, and then the rest of it was being exported, and these people starved to death. In fact, it was you could be either jailed or killed for hoarding grain. And hoarding grain means if you had any kernels of grain at all, that wasn't allowed to you by the authorities. So you could have a handful of kernels of grain, and that was enough to be sent to a concentration camp or to be outright killed. And it got so bad that people were selling body parts in the open-air markets sometimes of their own children who had passed away. And that's how terrible things got, because people decided, hey, we can just get together and decide what's what. No, God decides, and if you don't rein this in, it doesn't go anyplace good. So we should learn from that and take a page out of what Jehoiada and Joash did here and make sure that God's part of our covenant. So we'll finish there, and so then we'll move on. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings that you've given us. We ask that you would help us to see clearly the need to involve you in all of our covenants. Father, I pray that you would make us open to that, seeing the blessing and goodness that you bring. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you guys next week.